The American education system is one of the best education systems in the world. It is a juggernaut that employs millions of people and provides its youth with guided goalposts and a purpose. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Program for International Student Assessment, the United States, as of 2023, ranks number 18 in global education, which isn't the best out of the 79 participating countries, but it is effective enough to place the United States as number 3 on the Global Innovation Index, right behind Switzerland and Sweden. The achievements of the American education system can be explained by the astonishing amount of money that goes in and out of it. In fact, when all levels of the education system are accounted for, the education industry stands as the biggest industry in the United States. Elementary and secondary schools had a combined funding totaling over $900 billion for the 2020 to 2021 fiscal year, with post-secondary schools having a combined fundings and revenues at a whopping $993 billion within the same time frame. When you include private education and other forms of schooling, the entire educational service industry exceeds over $2 trillion a year. To understand where this money is coming from and how critical the education system is to the United States, we first need to investigate the history of education in the country. The history of American education is a testament to the nation's commitment to enlightenment and progress. From humble beginnings in one-room schoolhouses to the expansive networks of schools, colleges, and universities that dot the landscape today, education has remained a cornerstone of American identity. The founding fathers recognized its transformative power, viewing education as the linchpin of democracy and social mobility. In a country as diverse as the United States, education has been the greatest equalizer, paving pathways to prosperity for individuals regardless of their background. But it wasn't always like this. Education in the United States, until very recently, had been restricted to wealthy and influential families. The common people were largely uneducated and were restricted to manual labor. The country's first school was erected in 1635 in Boston. This was the Boston Latin School. In 1637, a decade after the school's establishment, the Old Deludar Satan Act was passed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which required a grammar school for any town with more than 50 households. This law was passed so Puritans in the colony could learn to read the Bible, hence the name Old Deludar Satan, in reference to the belief that Satan aims to keep the common man from being able to read the Bible. It became the first step toward compulsory government-directed public education in the country. However, the first true public high school was not established until 1821. The English High School of Boston's establishment in 1821 was what made education available to the working class. Nevertheless, public schools across the country with standardized curricula and compulsory education didn't take hold until the 1850s, following the educational reforms led by Horace Mann, the first Secretary of State for the Massachusetts Board of Education. The success of Horace Mann's reforms spread like wildfire throughout the country, leading to a surge in public schools built on federally granted land. Besides these land grants, the United States government only financially began funding the education system in 1917, when the Smith-Hughes Act was passed to provide federal funding for vocational education. This act was passed to tackle the growing demand for skilled workers and teachers in key industries that kept the country running, such as agriculture and industrial work. Since the Smith-Hughes Act, federal funding of the education system has grown to around 8 to 11%, mostly to support and guarantee education for all individuals, especially the disadvantaged and disabled. Besides this 8 to 11% contribution from the federal government, the remaining 92% of funds come from state and local sources. The federal government's low stake in education stems primarily from the fact that the Constitution of the United States doesn't mention education as a federal responsibility. And this is why some states and local communities can ban books or educational topics supported by the government. With states being responsible for the education of their people and the allocation of the resources to facilitate it, there's a need for a budget every school year. In fact, in every state, the budget for education accounts for a large percentage of the state's total budget. New York, for instance, allocated approximately 28% of its total budget to education during the 2021 to 2022 fiscal year. This amounted to around $74 billion out of a total state budget of approximately $212 billion. During this same fiscal year, Florida allocated approximately 28% of its total budget towards education. This amounted to around $21 billion out of a total budget of $104 billion. New York and Florida alone total $103 billion for education on a typical fiscal year. With this, the lucrative nature of the education industry begins to make more sense when the other 48 states are accounted for. There is simply an incredible amount of money flowing in and out of it. But where is it coming from? And where is it going? Every year, states set aside a large sum of money towards education. This money typically comes from sale taxes, personal income taxes, property taxes, and even lottery profits. Where this money goes is typically dictated by the state's education department. For instance, the State Education Department of New York had an available fund of $51 billion in 2022 and a recommended $39 billion for 2023. These funds were spread among the state's 731 school districts to support numerous education programs. These programs include school aid, pre-kindergarten, programs for students with disabilities, cultural education, adult and continuing education services, and higher education like state universities. These funds are ultimately used to pay the 200,000 plus teachers in the state's public education system, as well as the maintenance of its 4,411 public schools and 360 charter schools by custodians, bus drivers, counselors, nurses, and various other social workers. However, because this funding is on the state level, there's not much money to go around to all 731 school districts, of which New York City accounts for 32. But in consideration of New York City's population density compared to other cities and towns in the state, it receives more funding towards education. For the 2023 to 2024 school year, it had an education budget of $37 billion, of which $13 billion came from the state. The remaining $24.5 billion came from local and federal funding. Local funding accounted for $19.9 billion of this remaining amount and covers 53% of the city's total education budget. The source for local funding is similar to state funding. It comes from local taxes, sale taxes, and fees and fines, like parking violations and traffic tickets. For New York City, the combined state, local, and federal funding for education is spent generously. $15.1 billion goes towards K-12 schools and instruction, $7.3 billion goes towards employee benefits and pensions, $4.3 billion for school operations, $3.2 billion for debt payments, $3 billion for state-mandated payments to charter schools, $2.2 billion for early childhood birth to 5 services, $2 billion for non-public and contract schools per special education mandates, $300 million for superintendents and field officers, and $300 million for central administrative offices. All other states within the country follow a similar structure like this, and when all the funding is combined, it totals to over $900 billion a year. But, as mentioned earlier, this $900 billion is strictly regarding elementary and secondary school. Post-secondary education generates close to $1 trillion a year, based on 2020 to 2021 figures. When it comes to post-secondary education, there are 3 main types of institutions. There are public institutions, private non-profit institutions, and private for-profit institutions. Public institutions or universities are universities funded by a state government. University of California and Georgia Institute of Technology are examples of these public institutions. Then you have private non-profit institutions like Harvard University and the University of Pennsylvania. Private for-profit are universities like Full Sail University and the University of Phoenix. Aside from public universities, which get around 40% of their funding from the state, post-secondary institutions primarily get their funding or revenues from tuitions, investments, and alumni donations and gifts. There are other contributions, like the Higher Education Relief Fund grants from the federal government, which saw a massive spike in 2020 to 2021 because of the COVID pandemic. Much like state budgets for elementary and secondary public education, the fund's post-secondary education generates goes towards paying teachers and maintaining the functions of the school with custodians, medical staff, and so on. In addition to this, some of these funds are set aside for scholarships, which primarily serve to provide higher education to economically disadvantaged individuals. The money required to keep the education system in America running, while shocking, is not too surprising when you consider that the education industry employs over 4 million teachers, which is about 2.5% of the working population. When you add in other school staff like custodians, social workers, and so on, this number stretches to nearly 3% of the working population. There are also 51 million enrolled students in public elementary and secondary education, with post-secondary education having 18.1 million students, of which 11.6 million are full-time students. That's a total of 69.1 million out of America's 333 million people in the education system being supported and funded by federal and state governments in some shape or form, with a very small percentage of this paying completely out of pocket, either through their own funds or through a loan program of some kind. The student loan industry is another beast of its own to tackle, but to keep things short and to the point, the education system is an extremely lucrative industry that keeps the country running, which, to be frank, is obvious, as you need an educated population to keep a country like the United States functioning and at the top of the world. To sum things up, America's education system is a lucrative market. The amount of money that goes into it reflects America's desire to create opportunities for people to achieve their personal goals and have social mobility, while at the same time contributing positively to the country's innovative strength. This is why federal, state, and local governments make an active effort to ensure the transformative power of education remains by contributing heavily to the funds that keep the education system afloat. With funds and revenues totaling over $2 trillion a year, the American education system is a juggernaut worthy of a superpower.